Immediately fighting for central squares, this advance opens diagonals for the queen and king's bishop, setting the stage for rapid development. Unleashing the Nimzowitsch defense, this knight boldly challenges the center's immediate dominance, hinting at dynamic piece play and a flexible pawn structure to come. Gaining space on the queen side, this push forces the knight back and shapes the central pawn structure for the coming skirmish. The knight bravely ventures forward, contesting central space and preparing to disrupt white's pawn chain. Anchoring the pawn chain, white boldly stakes a claim in the center, preparing to deploy pieces behind its formidable structure. Liberating the queen's bishop and solidifying central influence, d6 immediately challenges white's aggressive pawn thrust, aiming to disrupt the opponent's spatial advantage. Developing a knight to support the central pawn push and prepare for castling maintains white's initiative. Unpinning the knight and developing the bishop aggressively, the dark-squared piece now eyes the king side, potentially disrupting white's pawn chain. Developing the bishop here aims to prepare for kingside castling and potentially initiate a queenside pawn storm. Solidifying the pawn structure to prepare for a queenside expansion creates a robust defensive shell. Securing the king with castling initiates a defensive posture, potentially paving the way for central pawn advances later. Sacrificing a pawn here opens the center, demanding careful calculation to reclaim material or develop a dangerous initiative against white's king. Seizing central space, white liberates the queen's bishop and targets black's awkwardly placed knight. Initiating a queen recapture, black opens lines while potentially exposing their king's shelter. Unifying the queen with the central pawn structure bolsters white's control and prepares for potential pawn advancements or piece activity. Repositioning the knight to d7 aims to consolidate, perhaps preparing for a queenside expansion or reinforcing central control by allowing the f8 bishop to develop. Asserting central space aggressively, this pawn thrust opens aggressive attacking lines but weakens the kingside's pawn shield. Releasing central tension opens avenues but concedes a tempo for piece development. Expanding influence across the queenside, this pawn thrust aims to disrupt black's central structure and seize more space. The knight retreats, seeking safety and a new avenue of attack on the queenside flank. Solidifying the center, this bishop prepares for a central pawn push, aiming to cramp black's knight. Consolidating the knight's safety and preparing for piece development, this bishop move aims to prepare kingside castling and solidify the central pawn structure. Solidifying central control while preparing for kingside operations, this move efficiently mobilizes another piece. Securing the monarch against potential kingside threats initiates a crucial phase of defensive preparation. This maneuver activates the rook, eyeing potential queenside pressure and preparing to contest the central files after pawn advances. Centralizing the queen initiates a dynamic pawn push on the queenside, aiming to dislodge the knight. Concentrating forces on the d-file opens avenues for future queenside pressure and central control. Re-establishing the rook's presence on the open file ensures mobility and potential central influence. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure, this gambit prepares for potential pawn advances or to open the b-file for the rook. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside often proves risky, potentially weakening your own monarch's defenses. Repositioning the knight to a more active square, aiming for queenside pressure and supporting the pawn chain. Consolidating the bishop's influence on the long diagonal opens up avenues for future central pawn pushes. Solidifying the center with the bishop eyes potential queenside advances. Acing the central tension, black ignites the queen's offensive potential, eyeing the weakened light squares around white's king. Repositioning the knight to e1 aims to reinforce the center and potentially reroute to a more active square, perhaps g2 or f3, after preparing further pawn advances. Reuniting the rooks on the open file signals an intent to contest central space and potentially pressure the white king's pawn shield. Consolidating pieces on the central files will soon dominate this strategic contest. Repositioning the knight to the queenside aims to challenge white's central pawns and prepare for potential counterplay. Nf3 reasserts central pressure and prepares kingside activity, anticipating a potential pawn storm. Recentralizing the queen offers better defensive cover and prepares to contest the d-file. A repositioning to infiltrate the queenside, this knight eyes potential outposts and disrupts black's queenside structure. Restoring the knight to its initial guard, post on d7 allows for a potential regrouping and bolsters the queenside pawn structure. Clearing the path for the d-pawn, this queen repositioning readies an attack on black's d6 pawn. Reorganizing the bishop, preparing to potentially challenge the d-file if white commits to further d-pawn advances. Returning the knight to its original square hints at a positional shift, perhaps preparing to redeploy it to a more active square or to reinforce the kingside. Realigning the knight to the king's flank offers crucial defensive support against any potential pawn breaks. Centering the queen on c1 aims to reorganize pieces, prepare queenside expansion, or potentially target weaknesses on that wing. Nabbing the central outpost, that knight now dictates crucial squares, potentially disrupting white's pawn structure and limiting piece mobility. The knight's retreat opens a quiet diagonal for the queen and prepares for queenside expansion. Sacrificing the knight opens a vital diagonal for the queen, creating immediate threats. The king voluntarily exits its protective shell, initiating a daring central excursion. Returning the knight to d7 may seem passive, but it prepares to contest the central d-file and reinforces the e6 pawn. Shifting queen intent opens up the e-file for potential action. Exchanging knights here simplifies matters, aiming to exploit the weakened d-pawn and open lines for your rooks. Opening the f-file immediately intensifies the pressure on black's kingside. This squares the queen to a more active diagonal, eyeing the weak kingside pawns. Anchoring the knight on a4 offers no immediate prospect, potentially allowing black to build pressure on the queenside. Shifting the rook to the 7th rank creates a positional squeeze, eyeing potential weaknesses on that back rank. Consolidating piece mobility and reinforcing kingside presence becomes paramount now. Consolidating defensive pieces is paramount, with the king's shelter becoming a concern. Shifting the king opens a diagonal for the bishop and prepares to activate the rooks on the kingside. Repositioning the bishop to g5 creates a diagonal threat, potentially pressuring white's kingside. The rook's retreat frees the queen for active engagement on the kingside. Reorienting the queen to join the central struggle offers flexible attacking potential and prepares to challenge the d-file. Sharpening the pawn structure creates a closed position, potentially restricting black's active pieces and offering white more central control. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure offers queenside space, though it sacrifices central dynamism. Repositioning the knight to b1 aims to support a potential pawn push on c5, while avoiding the current knight tangle. Aims to reroute the queen to a more active diagonal, potentially supporting a pawn push or eyeing weaknesses. Shifting the knight to the queenside aims to disrupt black's pieces and potentially pressure the queenside pawns. Shifting the bishop allows for future queenside pressure and potential central pawn breaks, aiming to exploit white's somewhat passive knight. A valiant knight redeploys to contest the central square, aiming to disrupt black's developing queenside initiative. Reclaiming the bishop's influence aims to bolster the queenside defense against potential pawn pushes. A bold initiative, concentrating forces on the d-file to exploit any potential weaknesses in black's structure. Shifting the rook to the b-file aims to pressure white's queenside pawns and potentially create counterplay on that flank. Reinforcing the queenside pawn structure with this rook maneuver aims to solidify white's space and prepare for potential pawn advances. The queen vacates the d8 square, preparing to sidestep potential threats and possibly redeploy for a more active role in the center. Expanding on the queenside builds a crucial outpost for the knight and prepares for a potential breakthrough. Breaking open the queenside with this pawn capture offers dynamic counterplay. Seizing the open file initiates an aggressive central push. Sacrificing the bishop for pawn structure, opening lines, and inviting central breakthroughs. Opening the E file after the exchange finally grants white an important open attacking avenue for the rook. Unlocking the queenside pawns with this queen sortie offers dynamic counterplay, though it risks exposure if white can consolidate their central advantage. Harnessing the open D file to threaten a kingside invasion, preparing for dynamic exchanges. Reactivating the rook on the open file to challenge white's queenside pawn structure feels purposeful. Aimed at activating the queen and threatening the B4 pawn, this prepares a potential kingside invasion. A cautious maneuver, seeking to reposition the queen for potential pressure on the queenside or a passive defense. Reactivating the rook offers better coordination and control of open lines. Liberating the king from its passive post, this allows it to potentially participate in the pawn-heavy battle on the queenside. Reinforcing the queenside pawn chain while preparing for a potential kingside pawn storm. Opening a queenside pawn avalanche to disrupt white's queenside buildup. Exerting pressure along the semi-open C-file, preparing for a potential queenside pawn advance. Opening the D-file offers black a chance to activate its rooks and potentially disrupt white's queenside pawn structure. Opening the C-file after the exchange creates significant pressure on black's queenside pawns and potential attack vectors. Seizing the open file with a desperate king check, this pawn sacrifice aims to disrupt white's queenside advantage. Shifting the king towards the center offers a surprising escape from the compromised queenside and prepares for active king play. A daring gambit, opening lines and hoping to disrupt white's pawn chain with this exchange. Unleashing a decisive discovered check, forcing the black king into a perilous square. Attempting to solidify the king's safety and prepare for defense on the queenside. Decisively seizing the D-file opens a swift path to checkmate, overwhelming the king's defenses. Sacrificing the rook opens up a critical diagonal, a desperate attempt to disrupt white's decisive pawn push and gain an unexpected tactical advantage. Capturing the pawn opens a diagonal for the queen, creating immediate mating threats. Defending the pawn allows for potential counterplay on the kingside and prevents white from further steamrolling the center. Sacrificing the queen to force a checkmate is a bold gamble that hinges on precise calculation of the ensuing king hunt. Relocating the king to a safer square seems prudent given the ongoing pawn storm and potential checks. Bringing the queen to the open 8th rank exerts immense pressure on black's vulnerable king. Unleashing a pawn chain, black attempts to create attacking momentum on the queenside, hoping to disrupt white's carefully constructed position and open avenues for counterplay. Seizing the queenside with a pawn sacrifice to disrupt the defense and expose the black king's safety is a bold but potentially decisive step. A final checkmate appears inevitable as the queen controls the decisive open file, leaving the black king exposed. Unlocking the queenside pawn majority creates a potent promotion threat. Re-establishing a defensive structure now that the queens are off the board is paramount. Recapturing the pawn opens the rook to pressure the 7th rank, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and launch a final assault on the exposed king. Liberating the rook from pawn protection finally activates it into the fray. Securing the passed pawn's advance, this push creates immediate threats and opens new avenues for exploitation. The rook now retreats, seeking safer ground after the queen's capture and the pawn's advance. Restoring the king to safety allows for a more aggressive endgame strategy, centralizing the monarch for support. Shifting the king toward the center now is crucial for activating its defensive and offensive potential in the upcoming simplified position. King activation is paramount now to support the pawn's advance. Embrace the central outpost and eye the threatened pawn. The king's safety remains paramount. Consolidating the rook to the 7th rank is a powerful positional maneuver. initiating a strategic repositioning to protect the king from further checks and solidify the pawn structure. King activation is paramount to solidify the position and prepare for the final push. Pushing the king forward is a bold step, aiming to activate the monarch in this endgame. Solidifying the king's safety on a central square is paramount as the queens depart, preparing for an active endgame. Securing the rook's path to the c-file is paramount for immediate counterplay. Positioning the king centrally solidifies the pawn structure, creating a fortress against black's remaining pieces. Consolidating the king's safety and preparing to challenge the passed b-pawn is paramount now. Unleashing a decisive discovered attack, the rook's check drives the black king from its defensive shell, paving the way for a swift mating net. King safety now a paramount concern as the rook penetrates. The rook's decisive check aggressively pursues the black king, aiming to simplify into a winning pawn advantage. Sacrificing the knight seems to invite further complications, but perhaps black has a hidden resource in the queenside pawns. Unleashing the king into the fray opens a critical diagonal for potential endgame domination.